Hey everybody, and Tony here with my review of Mozart's Die Zauberflöte with conductor Giuseppe Mentuccia, which I saw at the Staatsoper unter den Linden. I wanted to see this production of Zauberflöte by Yuval Sharon again because I wanted to see and hear Rainelle Krause singing the role of the Queen of the Night. And Rainelle Krause is a rather interesting singer because she has been very well known for not only her prowess as a singer, but also her physical prowess as an aerial acrobat who combined her vocal interpretation as well as theatrical interpretation of the Queen of the Night with her skills as an aerial acrobat to create something extremely unique, with results being quite interesting and really eye-opening, especially if people are hankering for something experimental. And as I saw her performance as the Queen of the Night, she was thoroughly intrepid. She was not afraid to fly around the stage given her experience as an aerial acrobat. She was sufficiently fearless. She managed to make the best out of the Queen of the Night's appearances, especially in the second act when she had to fly around the stage with the help of harnesses. And she showed no signs of fear, no signs of trepidation. She was thoroughly fierce in what she had to present as a singing actress, as well as an overall trooper from beginning to end, specifically evidenced in the second act of the opera, where she pretty much flew around the stage with the greatest of ease. Aside from me commending her for her fearlessness in terms of her flying around the stage, specifically in the second act, I also have to give her props for what she was able to accomplish as a fine lyric coloratura soprano. Yes, her voice does have sufficient pliability and agility, and she was able to attack those high notes with everything she's got, helped by a silvery timbre which also made her voice shine sufficiently well. However, if you know me, I am more in favor of a true dramatic coloratura soprano singing the role of the Queen of the Night. Whenever I think of a dramatic coloratura soprano singing the role of the Queen of the Night, I would automatically think about voices such as Serafina Di Neva, Ray Woodland, Colette Laurent, Jutta Fulpius, Margareta Hallen, Christina Deutecom, Christiane Edda-Pierre, Sylvia Gesti, Rita Shane, Edda Moser, Ursula Kossuth, Monica Pic-Hieronymi, Sally Wolf, Sharon Christman, Kathleen Casello, Helen Kwon, Claudia Kunz-Eisenlohr, Elena Moschuk, Laura Aiken, Anna Kristina Capola, Svetlana Nikitenko, and even Clara Kolonitz, and even the much older voices such as Elisa Elitza, Berta Kurina, Selma Kurz, Melita Heim, Hedwig Francillo Kaufmann, Maria Gerhardt, and Frida Hempel. Those were voices that had more sufficient control as well as sufficient strength in not only the top notes, especially those high Fs, but also in the chest tones and in the middle notes. With Rainelle Krause, while I can give her sufficient credit for attacking those high notes with silvery ease, there were occasions in which her middle notes and her chest tones weren't that audible in her second act aria, although I did manage to commend her for using sufficient chest tones in her first act aria, which is kind of a shame because Rainelle Krause has wonderful material to work with, not only as the Queen of the Night, but in many roles I would love to hear her in the future. Aside from Queen of the Night, I would love to see a lot more of her as Constance, Donna Anna, Marguerite de Valois from Les Huguenots, Marguerite from Faust, Isabelle from Robert le Diable, Antonia from Le Comte of Man, Esclarmonde from Massenet's Esclarmonde, Zita from Massenet's Le Roi de l'Aurore, Amalia from Verdi's I Masnadieri, Alzira from Verdi's Alzira, and maybe even as the title role of Richard Strauss's Daphne. The possibilities for Rainelle Krause are absolutely endless, and she has wonderful material to work with, but she really needs to develop her technique in the right way, not only keeping her high notes intact, but also really working on the middle and the lower notes so that her voice will become a lot more complete. Therefore, while Rainelle Krause isn't really a voice I would easily associate with the Queen of the Night, although she does have the notes, I do have to commend her for her overall commitment as a singing actress, as well as an overall trooper who was not afraid to get herself on those harnesses and fly around the stage, especially in her second act aria, Der Hölle Rache. So I still have to salute Rainelle Krause for what she was able to accomplish as the Queen of the Night. Stealing the show as Pamina was Victoria Randem, who I also saw last year in that very same role. And I thought that she was a truly sterling and beautiful light lyric soprano who was able to use that voice of hers to sing over the orchestra and to create such a charismatic, warm, soulful, and gorgeously wonderful character in Pamina. Over the years, I have seen Miss Randem's career grow from strength to strength. She started off as these soubrette-ish roles such as both Countess Ceprano and the page boy from Rigoletto, and even Papagena in that very same production barely 4 years ago. And even last year, I was really excited to see and hear her as Pamina, and here she was singing up the storm as this wonderful heroine. That silvery, luscious, and well-toned light lyric soprano voice managed to steal my heart in the best possible way, and her technique was truly sterling. Yes, her voice may not have that additional focus that I really love in other sopranos such as Lisa de la Casa, René Doria, Irmgard Siegfried, Lucina Mara, Hilde Guden, Melita Museli, Judith Raskin, Ruth Margret Putz, Christiane Sorel, Anna Moffo, Benita Valente, Colette Bocchi, Valerie Masterson, Edith Matis, Lucia Pop, Ileana Kotrubash, Patricia Wise, Gail Robinson, Faye Robinson, Elisabeth Norburg-Schultz, and Ruth Ann Swenson, as well as many old school singers such as Elisabeth Schumann, Aide Norena, and my personal favorite old school Pamina, Lotte Schöne, who was also once upon a time a prominent Papagena in her Vienna years. However, Victoria Randem is in a class of her own, and she definitely proved it. And I would love to hear this fine light lyric soprano have a go at not only continuing her tenure as Pamina, but also Fiordiligi, Ilia from Idomeneo, Sandrina from La Finta Giardiniera, Gilda from Rigoletto, Magda from La Rondine, Melisande from Peleas et Melisande, Masnes Manon, Berthe from Meyerbeer's Le Prophète, Zdenka from Richard Strauss's Arabella, Aitra from Richard Strauss's Die Ägyptische Helena, and if she keeps developing her top notes, then Donizetti's Lucia della Mermur and Violetta from Verdi's La Traviata. The possibilities for Victoria Randem are absolutely endless, so long as she keeps her light lyric soprano voice intact and not abuse her naturally lovely light lyric soprano voice. She will definitely remain on all the world's great opera stages for many years to come, and here's also hoping that she will continue to go from strength to strength, not only as a fine singing actress, but as an overall performer. She definitely has great material to work with, and here's also hoping that she will never squander her talent. And I believe that she will continue to strengthen her technique to the best of her possibilities, and of course, give a lot of great performances for many years to come. Regina Koncz was a sweet and delicate Papagena, but her voice was quite smallish, even though she does have a pleasant technique and an equally pleasant timbre. And it also says something when old school sopranos such as Lotta Schöne, Adele Kern, Emmy Luse, Alda Noni, Laurel Hurley, and Gertrude Friedman had far sturdier techniques than what Miss Koncz had to offer. Nevertheless, Regina Koncz used her lovely stage presence to the best of her abilities, and here's also hoping that she will continue to grow her voice in the right direction, because there is a fine lyric coloratura soprano voice in there that is waiting to emerge, especially with roles such as Zerbinetta from Ariadne auf Naxos, Di Fiaccrimilli from Strauss's Arabella, Oscar from Un ballo in maschera, Gilda from Rigoletto, Musetta from La Bohème, Lisette from La Rondine, and Lauretta from Gianni Schicchi. Regina Kontz's light, silvery, lyric coloratura soprano voice is in evidence of full growth, and I would really love to see her grow from strength to strength, as well as let her lovely voice out in the best possible way, because there is a fine voice in there, and I do not want to hear any squandering of her talents whatsoever. The three ladies were superbly sung, from Klara Nadeshtin's gorgeous, well-controlled and well-toned light lyric soprano voice as the first lady, Natalia Skritska's solid and well-toned mezzo-soprano voice as the second lady, and Anakis Judith, who although tended to have slightly inaudible lower notes, managed to pick herself up rather well and really sing throughout the evening as the third lady, and their overall group work as the three ladies was superb. And here's also hoping that Klara Nadeshtin, Natalia Skritska, and Anakis Judith continue to develop their voices in the right way, because there is a lot of potential for them to keep on growing from strength to strength, as well as continue to shine like the brightest of stars. I've always loved René Pape's dignified performance as Sarastro. Theatrically speaking, he does have a strong sense of authority as this iconic high priest. However, in terms of his voice, there were times that I thought that he lacked that extra depth that he needed, but that's not to say that he was a terrible singer. In fact, his voice still managed to radiate with that dignity that makes Sarastro a strong character, although I do miss that additional squillo that I love in many true basso profondos singing this role, such as Emanuel Liszt, Ezio Pinza, Alexander Kipnis, and even Jerome Hines, Giorgio Tozzi, Cesare Siepi. And lest I forget about my personal favorite Sarastro of all time, Martti Talvela, by virtue of his cavernous, huge, regal, and absolutely awesome voice that managed to let my heart sink, and lest I forget about my favorite old school basso profondos as Sarastro, such as Herbert Alsen, Gottlob Frick, Kurt Böhme, and Josef Greindl, all thanks to their round, rich, dark, cavernous, and absolutely awesome basso profondo voices. With René Pape, yes, I do like the dignity that he managed to emit as Sarastro, as he always had, but I still do miss that basso profondo cavernousness, and I still do miss that dark quality that I love in any basso profondo singing Sarastro, but I still have to give him some credit where credit is due in terms of him being such a fine singing actor, even though I would have loved to have a little bit more extra beef in that voice of his. Regardless of whatever issues I had with René Pape, he was still able to be dignified, and he carried himself out quite well as Sarastro. Benjamin Hamandi does have a fine bass baritone voice as the second arm man, but his voice was mercilessly drowned out by Stefan Rugamer's first armed man, which is quite a shame because he does have fine material to work with, and here's also hoping that Mr. Hamandi develops his technique in the right way and really work on those deep, dark chest tones. David Ostrek had sufficient vocal presence as both the speaker of the temple as well as the second priest. While I do believe that his voice does complement René Pape's darker voice well, I'm still missing the extra beefiness and that extra richness that I love in voices such as my personal favorite speaker of the temple, Hans Hotte, as well as Franz Krass, whose dark voices managed to serve the role of the speaker really well. With David Ostrek in terms of doing double duty as both the speaker of the temple and the second priest, he did have sufficient vocal presence. It was a fine bass baritone voice as it's always been, and I also feel like it's gained a lot more in focus as well as in nobility. So I still have to give David Ostrek credit where credit is due in terms of his sufficiently noble singing as the speaker of the temple as well as the second priest. Roman Trekel was a sufficiently charismatic Papageno, although listening to his voice these days, he does sound like he has some wear and tear going about it, but there's still a semblance of a voice that he managed to emit as Papageno, especially considering that his lyric baritone voice was put to fine use in this role, and he did manage to also steal the show from Magnus Dietrich's feat as Tamino, and I'll gladly talk about him much later in this review. But with Roman Trekel as Papageno, even though his voice did show some signs of wear and tear and a bit of a tremolo and a wobble here, he still had sufficient vocal presence to make Papageno charming, as well as some fine acting chops to add to his charm. Yes, I do miss more squealo-ish voices that had more meat and more strength in them, such as Carl Schmidt-Walter, Alfred Pöll, Erich Kunz, and of course Hermann Prey and Willy Domgraf Fassbender. And lest I forget about Giuseppe Taddei and Walter Berry as my personal favorite Papagenos, as well as Vladimiro Ganzarolli, who also served his voice well, which is that of a bass baritone as Papageno. However, all caveats with Roman Trekel's vocal production aside, considering the wobbles and tremolos that I've been hearing in his voice, I still have to give him credit for his charisma as a performer, as well as what he was able to accomplish as Papageno. Speaking of Stefan Rügema as the first armed man, yes, he did have a strong vocal presence in that role. However, I still felt like his voice lacked that extra squealo and that extra metal to make this role imposing, although he did have the volume. Voices such as James King, Helmut Melchert, Ernest Häfliger, and even Peter Hofmann come to mind in terms of having an imposing quality as the first armed man. Nevertheless, Stefan Rügema was able to be a fine vocalist, even though I thought that his light lyric tenor voice was not really a nice fit for the first armed man. Nevertheless, he still did a fine job, and I still have to commend him for bringing out the best as the first armed man. Magnus Dietrich struck again as Tamino, and I definitely loved his performance a lot more than when I first heard him in the role a year ago. 1 year ago, I thought that his voice was more unsteady, and even though he had a strong vocal presence, he still had that unsteadiness in his voice and that insufficient chestiness that I was not a fan of. Here, I thought his performance was much better. He was a little bit more steady, even though he could develop his chest tones a lot more and really straighten out his tone a lot more, because I could still hear that unsteadiness and I could still hear that insecurity in his voice, but his voice still had a strong vocal presence as it managed to ring throughout the theater quite well, and it also had an interestingly steely quality to it that made him a strong vocal interpreter from beginning to end, as well as an overall strong singing actor. I can never, ever for the life of me neglect voices such as Richard Taube, Coleman von Pataki, Helga Roswenger, Rudolf Schock, Charles Cullman, Brian Sullivan, Nikolai Gedda, Fritz Wunderlich, Francisco Araiza, Jerry Hadley, and even the likes of Andreas Dippel, Walter Ludwig, Anton der Mota, Siegfried Jerusalem, and Peter Hofmann, as well as Will Hartmann, who were all superb taminos thanks to their strong voices as well as equally superb techniques. And out of all the taminos I've mentioned, Fritz Wunderlich will always be my personal tamino par excellence, thanks to his sweeping use of breath as well as his focused sense of musicianship. With Magnus Dietrich, he still had that unsteadiness in his voice, but what he lacked in vocal steadiness, he more than compensated with vocal strength as well as charisma and loads of endurance. So here's also hoping that I get to see him in more Italian and French roles such as Edgardo from Lucia de Lammermoor, Alfredo from La Traviata, the Duke from Rigoletto, Rodolfo from La Bohème, Rogero from La Rondine, De Grieux from Massenet Manon, Nadir from Bizet's Le Pêcheur de Perles, Gérald from Delibes' Lacmé, Tebaldo from Bellini's I Capuletti e Montecchi, and maybe even Julien from Charpentier's Louise. The possibilities for this young lyric tenor are absolutely endless so long as he does not abuse his voice in the worst possible way, but develop his voice and take great care of his voice and nurture his talent as a fine lyric tenor, because he does have great material and an equally great future to look forward to. Johann Krogius definitely stole the show as the first priest by virtue of his fine lyric tenor voice, and here's also hoping that he continues to develop his technique and further strengthen his technique to sing all the major roles, because that is a fine and lovely voice right there, and one that I love so much thanks to its pristine technique. Florian Hofmann was a decent monostatos. However, I am not so crazy about the production of his voice because it did sound rather nasal and it did sound rather whitish in stark comparison to a lot of the great monostatoses of the past, such as Gerhard Unger, Gerhard Stolze, and my personal favorite, Friedrich Lenz. That's not to say he was a bad singer, it's just that his voice was decent, it had decent emission, and it had a nice character tenor quality to it, but it's not a voice that I think is anything extremely special, because it did have that whitish tone, but he was still a fine musician all the way through, and he did a fine and serviceable job as monostatos. Special acknowledgement has to go to the soloists of the children's opera of the Staatsoper unter den Linden for wonderfully lovely singing as the three boys, as well as Moritz Hase, Antonia Kruschel, Enrico Labatte, Laura Lupi, Maximilian Reisinger, and Lisa Schramm, using their talents as the performers very well, and especially the children performers who were able to keep the opera as interesting and as lively as possible. So overall, the singing was solid all the way through, and I still have to give major props to Victoria Randem's gorgeously sung Pamina, as well as the intrepid work that Rainelle Krause managed to do as the Queen of the Night, and lest I forget about René Pappe's dignified Sarastro, Roman Treker's charismatic Papageno, Magnus Dietrich's solidly sung Tamino, Regina Kontz's sweetly sung Papagena, and the fine collaboration done by the three ladies sung by Klara Nadeshtin, Natalia Skritska, and Anakis Judith. I still have to give my props off to Florian Hofmann as Monostatos, Benjamin Khamandi, Stefan Rugama, David Ostrek, and Johann Krogius for equally fine jobs in their respective roles. But more than anybody, it was Victoria Randem who stole the show as Pamina, followed by Rainelle Krause, who was an intrepid performer as the Queen of the Night. The conducting done by Giuseppe Mentuccia did end up being rather inconsistent in terms of pace and in terms of trying to keep the orchestra and the singers together, because there were times in which the orchestra and the singers did not go in sync. There were times that he dragged, there were times that he was too fast, and it was just an overall inconsistent job that he did as a conductor. Nevertheless, he did try to keep the orchestra going and flowing, but it was kind of an up and downhill scenario here and there, and at least there were occasions in which the speed for certain moments was actually serviceable, but the consistency was kind of lacking, although I will still give my major props to the Staatsoper unter den Linden's orchestra and chorus for doing such serviceable jobs keeping the evening rolling. So overall, with Rainelle Krause's intrepidness, Victoria Randem singing up a storm, and Regina Koncz being sufficiently sweet, these three ladies managed to do really fine jobs in their respective roles, especially Victoria Randem as Pamina, who continued to go from strength to strength, and the singing overall was really fine, all things considered. And for those of you who caught this particular production of Mozart's Die Zauberflöte at the Staatsoper unter den Linden, what did you think of it? Did you feel that Rainelle Krause, Victoria Randem, and Regina Koncz stole the show respectively as the Queen of the Night, Pamina, and Papagena? Did you feel like there was another singer who stole their thunder, such as the three ladies sung by Klara Nadeshtin, Natalia Skritska, and Anna Kisjudit? Or did you feel like the singing was not to your liking? Please comment below and let me know. Well, that's it for my review of Mozart's Die Zauberflöte from the Staatsoper unter den Linden starring Rainelle Krause as the Queen of the Night. Tune in next time for my review of Strauss's Arabella, also at the Deutsche Oper Berlin, starring Gabriela Scherer as the title heroine. So until then, good night everybody.